Good morning, ladies. So this week we are focusing on character analysis. We're going to be identifying character traits and then really focusing on character motivation and how the connection between two characters really impacts our plot. So if you take a look here at our resources for character traits, it says what we infer about a character's personality from his actions, thoughts, and words. Okay, so again, we're determining those traits. Those are the things that we focus on. Some strategies we might do is to highlight or underline in a different way when different characters are either speaking or we are getting inside their head and knowing their thoughts, or if different events are taking places and how they are reacting to that. And then we're really analyzing our characters. We're taking those traits and then we're applying it to what we are learning in the story. They have different dialogue, actions with other characters, and then their feelings and thoughts as they evolve throughout the story. We take a look down here, we have some tips for analyzing characters. So our first dot point says, think about the key characteristics of that character that define him or her. What would the character be like without that quality? Why did the author choose to include that? Next one, ask yourself, how did the actions of the characters impact other characters or the sequence of events? Is this a usual reaction for the character? Did he or she always act this way, or is this out of character for them? How does the reaction lead to other story events? Um, Focus on the changes in characters within stories. Did they learn a lesson? Did they go through a traumatic event? Does the author want us to learn something from this character's journey? And then focus on that point of view. Point of view can have a major impact on the story. Pay attention to the clue words that help determine if the story is told in first or third person. And think about the impact that has on the reader. If the story is told in third person and you don't get the perspective of a particular character, then imagine you are that character and step into his or her shoes. So again, those are just some tips and strategies as you go along in your stories this week. We just have a resource here, just a bunch of character traits that you can use. You can either apply them to the characters that you're reading this week or just kind of use this as a great resource. This was also in our ELA notebook resource section. Okay, so we're going to start with the other side of the glass. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to preview the questions that correlate with that one. So for Monday, pages 1 through 8, the prompt is, do you think Sarah should trust Queen Tatiana? Why or why not? And then for Tuesday, the prompt, based on her words and actions, what traits can be used to describe Sarah? So now we're going to take a peek and read the other side of the glass. Okay, so the other side of the glass. So this week we're working with two fictional stories. So again, at the front here, if you want to do some additional work, how would the story be different if Sarah hadn't listened to the queen and gone through the window? So these are some great kind of additional works that you can do if you want to challenge yourself, and I would love to even see them if you want to email them to Miss Egging. So let's take a peek here. Words to know, focus question. So should Sarah trust Queen Tatiana? Why or why not? So again, focusing on the words and actions, we're already getting introduced to our characters, Sarah and Queen Tatiana. So again, you're focusing on how they are at the beginning of the story, right when you get to it. You're focusing on words, actions, any sort of thoughts that the author is giving us, and then keep that in mind and see if they change throughout the story. Are they learning lessons? Are traumatic events happening? And how do they interact with each other and maybe additional characters? Alrighty. A chill crawls down Sarah's spine as she stops into the darkness beyond the doorway of the house in the woods. She blinks, her eyes adjusting to the lack of light, and for a moment she glimpses something very strange and disorienting. A world turned in on itself, whole fragments of earth and stone floating aimlessly among plates and candlesticks and various other objects. As quickly as it appeared, the vision recedes, and she stands with Jake on a sturdy wooden floor, ducks quacking behind them, in a dimly lit room she immediately recognizes. She has been there before. How did we get back to the porter's mill? She asks no one in particular. The room looks cleaner and more welcoming than the one in the hollow, yet the same room, she has no doubt. She steps farther inside, and the door slowly groans closed as Jake proceeds to inspect their surroundings. The same curved staircase disappears up into the second floor. No toys litter the floor, but a few chests of shelves neatly line the walls. filled with plates, flowers, and other knickknacks perfectly arranged. Seems more like a showroom than a house where someone lives. Jake, don't touch anything, Sarah snaps as Jake reaches for a small cowboy figurine on the shelf. Startled, he bumps into the statue and it shatters on the floor. Oh, he can do no harm here, a woman's voice says from the top of the stairs. The woman is stunning with a gentle smile, sparkling eyes, and thick brown hair pulled into a careless bun. She wears a simple, old-fashioned dress of dark red. Sarah, it's so lovely to see you, she continues as she descends on the staircase. Thomas pads down beside her and leaps into her arms, purring loudly as his tail flicks back and forth. It's nice to meet you too, Sarah replies, filled with conflicting emotion. Something about this woman unnerves her, but at the same time, the strange lady radiates a wonderfully maternal energy that makes Sarah want to hug her. Jake seems to feel no such conflict, as he embraces the woman heartedly. It's lovely to see you too, Jake, the woman said, patting his head. I'm sorry I broke your cowboy, he says. The woman smiles and winks at him. With a flick of her manicured finger, the figurine reassembles itself on the shelf. What's your name? Jake asks in wonder. Oh, how rude of me. I'm Queen Tatiana, but my friends call me Tati. Your mother has told me so much about you, Sarah. You knew my mom? Sarah squeaks as she leaps forward. Correction, child. I know your mother. She's here in the palace with me. Tati flashes one of the kindest smiles Sarah has ever seen. Can I see her? Where is she? Of course, my dear. Follow me. Queen Tatiana motions up the stairs and starts her ascent. Sarah's emotions surge as she can hardly contain her impatience. It takes everything she has not to bound ahead like Jake. When he reaches the upper landing, he freezes. As Sarah approaches, she understands why. While the lower level looks like Porter's Mill, and the upper level resembles a castle out of a fairy tale, intricate stained glass windows stretch into the sky, flanked on either side by stone pillars covered with slender vines that erupt with clusters of enormous, fragrant blossoms like wedding bouquets. Welcome to my humble abode, the queen says, gesturing around her. Sarah gapes up into the ceiling and wonders how they could have ever overlooked such structure from outside. As she watches, it seems as if the glass and stone near the top are shaking slightly, as though they're barely holding together. She blinks, and everything seems solid again. The passage they step into appears to have no edges, no end, and no doors. But that doesn't faze the queen as she begins to saunter away, her shoes clacking on the reflective tiles. Jake and Sarah follow, marveling at their surroundings. After a while, the queen halts, and Thomas leaps to the ground. Here we are, she says, and she waves her delicate hand toward one of the windows. Straight through there. Something doesn't feel right to Sarah as she pauses, clutching Jake's arm. Are you telling me to walk through that window? She asks. That doesn't seem safe. It's perfectly harmless. The queen sighs as she strodes over and thrusts her hand through the window with no resistance. The glass separates, and an opening spreads out beneath her hand, as if the glass itself were just a reflection on a sheet of cascading water. In the opening, Sarah sees only absolute darkness. Jake leans forward to try and see more, and Sarah knows that if she didn't have his arm, he would be through the opening in a heartbeat. There's nothing in there but blackness, she says, and the queen scowls for an instant before taking a deep breath and closing her eyes. Softly at first, light begins to radiate from within the darkness. Images begin to solidify. A white fence, a green yard, trees, blue sky, a house, her house, the old Victorian, the front door opening, a person stepping onto the porch. It's her mother. Sarah swallows back a sob at the sight of her mom on the front porch, waving, smiling, and beckoning Sarah to join her. Every thread of her being screams at her to run into her mom. Something still is not right. She blinks back tears and looks at the Queen, who has a smile plastered on her face. But for the first time, Sarah realizes the Queen's expression hides an immense amount of strain and tension, as if holding her hand in the glass requires incredible effort. "What are you waiting for?" the Queen asks. "Go to her, she's waited so long." It can't be real," Sarah replies, her voice cracking. "Go and see for yourself, child," the Queen says. "You can hold her, talk to her, love her. All the things you've been dreaming about your whole life are waiting for you on the other side of the glass. Do you want to see your mother, don't you?" "Yes," Sarah whispers. "You do love your mother, don't you?" "Yes." "Then go to her quickly. You can have everything you ever wanted if you just go to her." Sarah can restrain herself no longer. She gives into her tears as she dashes through the opening in the glass, across the grassy yard, into her mother's arms. They embrace each other for a long time, Sarah unwilling to release her mom after so many years. When they finally pull away, her mother takes her inside and gives her lemonade and cookies as they sit on the couch. Sarah recounts her life story from as far back as she can remember. She tells her about her childhood, her school, her friends, Dad, Aunt Tara, her goldfish that died and the cat that ate it, and the school play that she forgot her lines, her favorite food, roast beef, and how she couldn't get enough, the choir concert when she got sick behind the risers and kept singing, the night she, Quinn, and Jake were first lost in the hollow, the frightening laughter following them, the journal, Quinn's Uncle Jasper, the scissors, lamp, and key. Whenever Sarah asks her moms what she's been doing, she says, "Waiting here for you," and asks Sarah another question. When Sarah finishes telling her mom everything she can think of, it's nearly dark. They go into the dining room, where a feast of roast beef and all the fixins sit on the table. She's almost surprised when her dad said Aunt Tara coming in from the kitchen, smiling and laughing. Why should she be surprised? She's home with her mom. Of course they should be here. They're a family, and families eat dinner together. And dinner tastes better than anything she's ever eaten. And they all talk and talk and talk, until by the time dessert is finished, Sarah is nearly delirious with happiness. After dinner, they sit on the porch and watch fireflies twinkle in the air. A while later, a woman in a red, old-fashioned dress comes up the walk. "Are you enjoying your time with your family, Sarah?" she asks, smiling. Sarah recognizes her, but the memory is distant and foggy. Sarah nods and squeezes her mother's hand. The woman smiles and snaps her fingers, and everything around Sarah changes to sand, including her mother's hand. "No!" Sarah screams, clutching the handfuls of sand and weeping. The memory of everything that has happened comes crashing down on Sarah. "You bring her back, now!" "Sorry, I know this hurts, but you have to make a choice." The Queen kneels down, an expression of honest concern and pity on her face. "I can bring her back along with your family and your friends, everything that you ever wanted and dreamed of. I can make all of your pain go away, all of your loneliness, and it will be like it never happened. All you have to do is say you'll stay and that you'll help me. Will you stay and help me?" The turmoil in Sarah's head reaches a breaking point. Something is very wrong here. Queen is dangerous, but her mother has been living here for years unharmed. She says she can make the terrible things go away. But what kind of help does the Queen want from her? Does it matter? Is there anything she wouldn't do for her mom? All she has to do is say, yes. The Queen smiles, but this time it's triumphant. She takes a deep breath, waves her hand, and the world returns the way it was. Sarah's hand firmly grasps her mother's, and they all watch the woman in the red dress walk away. Who was that? Sarah asks. It's just a nice new neighbor, her mom says. It's time for bed, honey. As Sarah gets ready for bed, she can't shake the feeling that she's forgetting something. There's someone else who's supposed to be here, right? She asks her mom and tucks her in. He was with me, wasn't he? A boy with yellow hair, dressed like a cowboy. Where did he go? I don't know who you're talking about, my love, the mom says. Perhaps you're thinking of your favorite bedtime story. Am I? Yes, the one about the girl and the cowboy who goes through the magical doorway and are chased by frightening creatures before finding a palace and living happily ever after. Oh, yeah, Sarah says. That's my favorite story, Mom. Would you tell it to me again tonight? Of course I would. So our second book for this week is Meeting Mrs. Pierce. So let's go through and preview our prompts. So for Wednesday, prompt for pages 4 through 13. Based on her words and actions, what traits can be used to describe Charlotte's mama, Miss Hartley? For Thursday, pages 14 to 25, the prompt is, how did Charlotte's mother's actions influence Charlotte? And then for Friday, it's Happy Graduation Day, ladies, so you do not have an assignment, okay? I do want you to pay attention to the ReadWorks assignment for this week, the writing assignment, and the fight for women's suffrage. And don't forget to send me pictures of your reading log. So now we're going to go and read Meeting Mrs. Pierce. Meeting Mrs. Pierce. About women's suffrage. Less than 100 years ago, women's lives were very different than they are today. Women were expected to obey their fathers until they were married, and then to obey their husbands. They could not own property or sign contracts in their own names. They did not even have suffrage, which means the right to vote. The struggle to change that second-class status began in 1848. On July 19th and 20th, a group gathered in Seneca Falls, New York for a women's rights convention. At the end of the meeting, 100 people, 68 women and 32 sympathetic men, signed the declaration stating that the rights of women as human beings and citizens. This launched a movement that fought for women's right to vote, a movement known as the women's suffrage movement. The fight for the vote went on for 72 years. Women marched and demonstrated. They were insulted, pelted with everything from tomatoes to rotten eggs. They were even arrested, but they would not quit. In fact, it only increased their activity with time. Only increased their activity with time. In 1919, Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women full suffrage. It went to the states for ratification or approval, and on August 26, 1920, became the law of the land. Of the 68 women who signed the Declaration in Seneca Falls, only one lived long enough to vote. She was Charlotte Woodward, or Charlotte Pierce, after marriage. She was still a teenager when she attended the convention, and over 90 when she was able to vote in 1920. This is the Mrs. Pierce who appears in the story. Prologue. So again, prologue is what happens before the story. Charlotte Hartley, dressed with special care on that crisp November morning in 1920. After all, it was a historic occasion. Women had finally won the right to vote. Today, 21-year-old Charlotte would be one of the thousands to cast their first ballot. She wanted everything to be perfect. Her parents were still in the breakfast room when she got upstairs. Father never looked up from his morning paper, but considering all that had happened, Charlotte didn't expect anything else. Mama wiped her hands on her apron and managed an uncertain smile. You're going so early? Mrs. Pierce's idea, said Charlotte. I'm meeting her at the courthouse. Mama nodded, blinking back tears. Give her my best, she whispered. Mother and daughter embraced, and then Charlotte left without a backward glance. She caught a motor bus to the courthouse. The wheels clattered and the seats creaked, but Charlotte scarcely heard. because she was remembering the day 10 years ago when it all started. Chapter 1. The summer Charlotte turned 11, her life changed. It started one Saturday as she was curled up on the couch reading Little Women for the third time when a great gusting sneeze startled her. Her father loomed in the parlor doorway, looking at her with red-rimmed eyes. Why is your mother out? Go fetch her, please, he said. Tell her I have a rotten cold and I'm going up to bed. He took out a handkerchief and blew his nose. Charlotte closed her book without even bothering to mark the page. Of all the days for her father to come home early, this was the absolute worst. She started talking without knowing quite what she wanted to say. Father told her to stop babbling, but telling Father something he didn't like to hear was not an easy thing to do. Poor Elvira Foley wasn't feeling well, Charlotte finally stammered, and Mama went to be with her. It wasn't exactly a lie. Mrs. Foley really was suffering from one of her famous spells, but she had still come to walk with Mama to the secret meeting. Father muttered something about women gaddling everywhere in creation, and then he sneezed again. Well, go get her, and be quick about it. Yes, sir, said Charlotte, and she was off. She took her bicycle and rode leaning into the wind, her auburn hair whipping behind her, pedaling as fast as she could. It was not the least bit ladylike, but she didn't care if anyone stared. This was an emergency. She raced down the tree-lined streets of brownstones, past blocks of skinny roast houses, and into the center of town. At the Methodist church, she stopped in front of the social hall and rushed inside. There were signs everywhere. Votes for women. Women are citizens too. Women's suffrage now. Charlotte spotted her mother talking to an old woman with skin like crumpled parchment. She remembered her manners just long enough to apologize for her interrupting, but then she had launched into her story. By the time she was finished, her mother's face was pasty pale. Of all the times for him to come home early, she murmured, sounding scared. If he finds out where I am, he'll be furious. The other woman patted Mom's hands. Now don't you worry, Edith. Come along with me. The woman led the way outside to the green Ford town car, which was the prettiest, shiniest thing Charlotte had ever seen. The driver will take you home and come back for the rest of us, said the woman. Your husband will never know where you were. Tears welled in Mama's eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Pierce, she said, and the two women embraced. Charlotte would have loved to ride in the town car, but there was no time for loading her bicycle. She followed, this time sitting erect and pedaling at a decidedly ladylike pace. Oops, wrong way. When Charlotte got home, Mama had everything under control. She had given her father hot tea with lemon juice and honey and rubbed his chest with methylatum. And now he was sleeping peacefully. Mama sang to herself in the kitchen, stopping long enough to give Charlotte a big hug and tell her how smart she had been. If you hadn't kept your head today, your father might have found me out, and that would have been the end of my suffrage work. But why? The question had been bothering Charlotte for a long time. Mama went sneaking around as though she were robbing banks or something equally terrible, but the suffragists only wanted to vote. So why would anybody, even Father, object to that? They have a serviceable list of reasons, said Mama. Women have no head for politics or business. They don't belong in public life. The husband's job is to provide the wife and the family, while the wife bears the children, raises them, cares for the home, and obeys her husband at all times. Sounds dull, said Charlotte. Mama burst out laughing. Daughter dear, I think it's time you went to a suffrage meeting. That suited Charlotte just fine. Chapter 2. During the pleasant days of June through the steamy hot ones of July, Mama hinted at a surprise. To Charlotte, surprise was one of her most magical words in the English language. She asked dozens of questions, pestering and probing, even trying to trick her mother into revealing something. Nothing worked. Then at the suffrage meeting, Charlotte knew something was afoot the minute she walked in the door. Mrs. Pierce was waiting with two saved seats in the front row. In spite of the midsummer heat, the meeting was well attended. The women dressed for comfort rather than fashion, most without gloves, and some had taken off their hats. They sat fanning themselves with the leaf-shaped pasteboard fans that churches had by the boxful. The president called the meeting to order, and after the prayer and pledge of allegiance, she asked for introductions of guests and new members. Mrs. Pierce struggled to her feet, her wrinkled face made radiant by a broad smile. "Ladies," she said, "I'd like to introduce the fast-thinking little girl who rescued her mother last month." The old woman motioned Charlotte to her feet. "I'm proud to say that she's my namesake. Everyone say hello to Miss Charlotte Hartley." The audience applauded. Charlotte was shaking so badly that she feared her knees would give way. She was named for a living piece of the suffrage movement history, for Mrs. Pierce was none other than Charlotte Woodward, one of the founders. At the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, she was the 37th person to sign the Declaration of Women's Rights. "So do you like the surprise?" asked Mamma, smiling. For once in her life, Charlotte couldn't think of a thing to say, so she swallowed hard and nodded. It was inspiring, finding out she was named for an honest-to-goodness pioneer. But it was also scary, and she wondered how an 11-year-old could live up to the honor. So this is our pausing point before Chapter 3. If you want to pause the video here and do your prompt. Now we're going to continue with Chapter 3. Come September, Charlotte realized that there was one place where being 11 was an advantage: at school. Charlotte decided to rally her classmates to the cause. She would start a Girls' Suffrage Society, or GSS, because after all, girls grew up to be women. She started with girls whose mothers and sometimes even fathers were involved in the suffrage movement. Then she went to the tomboys, the bookworms, the girls who could do long division in their heads. She hesitated before inviting the pretty, frilly girls, but to her surprise, many of them accepted. Mama called that a lesson in not judging people before you knew them. Such prejudices about women have doomed generations to second-class status, she said. After recruiting 20 members and convincing a sympathetic teacher to let them meet in her classroom, Charlotte's first activity was to write the Declaration of Principles. They based it on the famous one that Mrs. Pierce had signed in the Seneca Falls Convention. The Declaration wasn't about voting, it was about dreams and hopes and wanting to be equal human beings. One girl wanted women to have the right to drive automobiles, while another wanted to ban corsets. After Charlotte copied the Declaration in her best penmanship, the members gathered to sign. Each girl stepped forward and wrote her name. And then Charlotte had held up the document for all to see. The Declaration of Rights of Future Women Citizens was indeed an impressive statement. Before the ink was even dry, Charlotte found herself scrambling for new activities. The grown-ups at Mama's meetings had plenty of ideas. They were planning to take the cause out of church social halls and into the streets. It was time to sway the hearts and minds of the people with huge rallies, speeches, and suffrage songs, they said. Charlotte loved the idea of public demonstrations, but Mama had nothing good to say about them. In one of their kitchen talks, she ranted against unseemly behavior. Making a spectacle of ourselves like that is undignified. Neither you nor I shall act in such an unladylike fashion. Mama, even Mrs. Pierce said it was time for action, remember? Charlotte raised one finger skyward as Mrs. Pierce did when she had something important to say. "We must make noise, my friends," she said in her best Mrs. Pierce imitation. "The battle for suffrage will be won in the court of public opinion." Mama laughed, sputtering a bit as if she were trying to hold back. "Very good, dear. You may just have your future for yourself in vaudeville theater." That was the end of the conversation, and try as she might, Charlotte could not bring the subject back around. There was no understanding Mama's strange attitude. That night, Charlotte lay awake thinking about it and listening to the glooming hooting of an owl. But by morning, she had a perfect idea for a new activity. There was no reason the GSS couldn't do something at school, something dramatic, something that would shape public opinion, just as Mrs. Pierce had wanted. Chapter 4. Charlotte had visions of a rally, a big one. We could have speeches and maybe read our declaration, she told GSS. From the murmur running through the room, she could tell that this idea was gaining support. I don't know where we'd have it exactly. In the auditorium, Elise Morrison squealed, cutting Charlotte off mid-sentence. She was on her feet, practically bouncing up and down. We could volunteer to do an assembly. It's perfect. And if we don't have to worry about attendance because every girl in school would have to be there. There was no need for more discussion. Everybody agreed at once. That night, Charlotte stayed up way past her bedtime writing a proposal. And the next morning, she took it to Assistant Headmistress Trotter. When Charlotte entered the office, she found Mrs. Trotter sitting behind an impossibly huge carved mahogany desk that dwarfed everything else in the room, including Mrs. Trotter, who smiled without showing any teeth. "I understand that you have an idea for an assembly, Miss Hartley," she said. It was not a promising beginning, but Charlotte cleared her throat and handed over the proposal. When Mrs. Trotter said the word suffrage, she paused. She pushed the paper away as if the ink were poisoned. "Suffrage is not an appropriate subject for an assembly. Parents do not send their little girls to school to have them learn such things." The interview ended almost before it had begun. Charlotte stood outside of her office door, caught between anger and humiliation. Anger won. She raced down the hallway and found Elise Morrison getting ready to go to class. "We're not going to have an assembly," Charlotte said, gasping for breath. She handed Elise the proposal that Miss Trotter had refused to read. "We are going to have to sign, carry, slogan, shouting, protest march." Chapter 5. On a damp and dreary Friday afternoon, the GSS members gathered in front of the school. As students poured out of the building after dismissal, the protesters began marching in a circle, chanting slogans and waving their signs. "Learn about suffrage! Support freedom of assembly! Girls, speak your mind!" Some students laughed, some booed, and some scurried past with their eyes lowered, pretending not to see me. But some stayed to watch, as if to lend support. Mrs. Trotter marched out and announced that she was going to start calling every home that had a telephone. Charlotte's mother arrived less than an hour later, but she did not come alone. 3 other suffragists, including Mrs. Pierce, came with her. Charlotte had been afraid to tell Mom about the protest, and now she was afraid to look her in the eye. "Mama, I'm sorry. I know you said we shouldn't do anything in public, but we had to do this. We just had to." "I know that, dear," Mama said. Her voice was perfectly calm, as if she had come to terms with something. "Now, do you have any extra signs that we might use?" Charlotte could scarcely believe what she was seeing. To old Mrs. Trotter's horror, one by one, Mom and the other suffragists picked up the signs and fell into line with the girls. Some of the onlookers broke into applause. It was a wonderful moment, or at least it was until Mrs. Trotter called the police. They came with 2 squad cars and a paddy wagon. A ruddy-faced sergeant tipped his cap to Mrs. Pierce. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but you ladies are trespassing. Now, I don't want to haul you off to jail." "That's good to know, Sergeant," said Mrs. Pierce. She didn't break stride, nor did anyone else in the line. The sergeant threw up his hands. All right, you ladies are under arrest. The children can go to school detention room." "No detention!" Charlotte shouted. "We want jail! We want jail!" The girls picked up the chant they had practiced for days, while Mama and the other suffragists laughed so hard they almost cried. "That does it!" shouted the beleaguered sergeant. "Everybody to the wagon!" Without breaking their line, the protesters marched to the paddy wagon. Charlotte led the way, with Mama and Mrs. Pierce behind her. Never in her life would Charlotte have thought that getting arrested could be such fun. Chapter 6. The fun ended when Father arrived at the police station. His eyes were cold, and he did not speak to Mama or Charlotte until they got home. Then he sent Charlotte to her room without dinner. She lay ramrod straight in bed, holding the covers tight under her chin. Once or twice she thought she heard her father shouting, and once a dish breaking. but mostly there was silence. Charlotte woke to the morning light without knowing when she had fallen asleep. She waited until she was sure father had left for the day. Then she raced downstairs to the kitchen, only to find her mother calmly washing breakfast dishes. "I saved you some oatmeal," she said. "You must be starved." Over reheated cereal, Charlotte learned of her mother's sacrifice. She had promised father she would quit the suffrage work forever, and she would never vote, even if it became legal. "But, Mama—" "It's all right, dear. I knew this was likely to happen when I picked up the protest sign." Charlotte began to tremble. "That's why you were so against public demonstrations?" "Because you didn't want father to find out." "Oh, Mama, this is all my fault." "Now don't you start crying. It is not your fault. The movement is going public, and I just couldn't hide any more." Mama washed out the sink and she dried her hands on a kitchen towel. "There is one good thing," she said. "This arrangement applies only to me, not to you." Charlotte got the message. She would not quit. She would fight for a world like the one Mrs. Pierce described, where being a person came before being a woman, and she would vote. Someday she would vote. Epilogue. So this is, remember, epilogue means what happens after the story ends. Mrs. Pierce arrived in the courthouse in the same green town car. It was nicked in a few places, but otherwise had borne the years well. And so, for that matter, it had its owner. Mrs. Pierce's hair was whiter and her wrinkles deeper, but her eyes still twinkled when she smiled. "We made it, my little namesake," she said. "Now let's hurry and vote. At my age, it is not wise to dawdle." Thank you, ladies.